So can everybody hear me okay? Ooh, that sounds loud. Bright lights. Hope that doesn't tip over. So I was saying upstairs that, you hear a lovely introduction like that, and they kind of pull together your various reviews and the nice things that have been said. And I was overwhelmed by this feeling that I should know what I'm doing by now. Like, that makes it sound like I know what I'm doing. And I'm at that stage in a book for all the writers out there where I've just started a new book. I'm about 15, I'll say 20,000 words in, but 15,000 is the truth. And it's just as hard as every other book. And I'm trying to get to the point where I just accept that it is pretty much chaos. Usually takes me a couple of years to write a book. For the first time, I have a book coming out within a year of each other. But for about the first year and a half of that 2 years, it's awful. The book's bad. It's never going to be a book. And then something goes like click. And I equate it to those, anybody, kids or grandkids, maybe you've had them. It's those boards where you put the gears on, and you have to arrange them just right, so when you turn the one over here, they all start turning. That's what it's like when you're writing a book. All of a sudden, it goes click, and everything starts working. So it's like a leap of faith that that's ever going to happen. So I'm in that it's never going to happen stage for the next year or so. So as I was preparing to come here and speak, those lights are so bright. I like to see people. I like to see if people are like interested in what I'm saying or if I need to spice it up a little bit. So as I was preparing to come here, and I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about, I found myself in this unusual situation. As I mentioned, this is the first time I have two books coming out within a year of each other. So I had one come out last summer, The Disappearing, and I've got one coming out this summer, Gone Too Long. So I was in this quandary: which of my babies do I talk about? The one that's out there on the table, or the one that have been really excited about? And then there's another book that I just started. So I can't remember the names of anybody from the other two books because I'm immersed in this book. So I had that quandary to deal with. And then I sort of settled on something. And then I came last night, as probably some of you were able to hear Bryan Stevenson speak. And I sat up there in the very back row. First, I got to look at this big room and this, like the picture up there. And then Mr. Stevenson came out, and he spoke for an hour about something very significant and powerful and important. And not only was it meaningful, but he did it flawlessly. He stood up here and talked for an hour, and he didn't use a single note card. And I've got my note cards right over there for my 25, 30-minute talk. But I was sitting up there watching, and people were obviously moved. And then to hear it sold out in a minute, the quickest for the event. I believe that's what you said, right? I mean, that was like, what a moment. And then I'm thinking, what am I going to talk about after that? So then I was in another quandary. I felt like I needed to go, I don't know, maybe something a little more personal about my work, just something a little more meaningful. And it got me to thinking about The Disappearing was my last book that came out this past summer. It's set in Florida. And around the promotion of that, I was asked to write an essay by a website through my publicist, and authors are often asked when they have a book coming out to do those sorts of promotional things. So I was asked to write this essay for this website, and I said, of course, I would be happy to do that. And because of the book before The Disappearing had been set in Kentucky, and then The Disappearing was set in Florida, and I had started to be called a writer of Southern Gothic fiction. So they said, how about you do something related to Southern Gothic fiction? And I was happy to do that because I'm a big fan of the genre. So as I sat down to do that, I don't write a lot of essays because they're difficult, just like short stories. I never touch poetry because that's the most difficult of all. As I sat down to write it, I spent some time thinking about and framed the article around a trip I took to Milledgeville when researching the disappearing. And at the time that I was writing, kind of finishing up the disappearing and starting to write the book that's coming out this coming summer, my daughter was going to college in Georgia, and she was playing college volleyball. So you can imagine I was taking a lot of trips into Georgia to watch my daughter's volleyball team. I live in Florida. It was about an 8-hour trip up to where she was going to college. So this one particular weekend, I had traveled to Milledgeville, Georgia, for a tournament that she was participating in. And is this thing okay? It seems to be like... So I was up in Milledgeville, and I got in about a day early because I wanted to do some research. And which makes you would understand now that my next book is set in Georgia because my daughter was in school in Georgia, so I was there and I was doing all this research, so it was two birds. So I was in Milledgeville and I wanted to do some research, and I had gone to the grocery store early in the morning, and I kind of asked a few folks that looked like they lived there. I said, what would you suggest I do? I want to kind of see the history, see what's a have to see while I'm here in Milledgeville. And both people suggested I take this tour that the downtown Chamber of Commerce or somebody gave. And so I looked into it, and I went downtown, and I got on this tour, and it was a great thing that the town offered. And so I was striking up a conversation with the tour guide, and he quickly learned of my love of Flannery O'Connor's work, and Flannery O'Connor has close ties to Milledgeville, for those who don't know. And we got into a bit of a little debate about he liked Margaret Mitchell's version of the South better than Flannery O'Connor's, and I was like, well, Margaret Mitchell's version of the South was quite romanticized, and he was taking it all in good fun, and I was kind of acting like it was all in good fun, but I took it quite seriously. So anyway, the tour goes on, and it was great. We got to go into an antebellum home, and really great access. You know, a lot of times you go into these old homes, and they're all roped off, and you can just kind of look in from the entry, you know. But this one, they were just like, have at it, you know, walk around, and this gorgeous home. We saw several sites there in the town. And as we're driving down one of the roads, we pass a cemetery. And the gentleman says, the tour guide, he says, by the way, Flannery O'Connor's buried right there. And I kind of sit up, and he says, yeah, right there, kind of near the fence, near that electric pole. And so I'm trying to get my bearings quickly. I don't know Milledgeville. I kind of look for the cross streets because I want to come back later and see if I can find it. When the tour ends, and now the reason that I'm in Milledgeville is to go to the volleyball match, so I can't go to the cemetery yet. I go to the volleyball match. And as often happens, they're running late, and I'm watching my watch because now I'm coming up against sunset. And I want to get to the cemetery that night because the next morning I'm leaving bright and early. I have a trip to, my trip back home is about 8 hours. So I'm watching the clock, and I'm like, come on, let's get this match going. And then the match starts, and then it goes 3 sets, which is like overtime for those of you who don't know volleyball. And then it's finally over, and the time is ticking. It's sunset. So I go, and I think they lost. I really don't remember. I give my daughter the quick, you'll get them next time hug. And I'm out the door, and I'm got my Google Maps, and I get back to the cemetery. And as I'm pulling in, it's pretty much dusk now. The only other car in the cemetery is pulling out as I pull in. And it's through these big iron, black kind of Gothic gates, and definitely a historic cemetery, many historic graves, 1800s, pre-Civil War, Civil War. And he said, by the gate, by the light pole. So I go back and I'm looking, and the graves are they're not particularly orderly. There's several, it seems, in one plot. The stones are sinking. They're very, very old. I'm really struggling to read any of the headstones. And I thought, this is Flannery O'Connor's grave. In my mind, I thought there's going to be strobe lights and flowers everywhere, and I couldn't find it. And then I noticed there's kind of a gazebo near the entrance, and I can see that there's information posted in there. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to go see if they happen to have a map of the cemetery. So I hustle back up there. Now it's getting dark, or it's pretty dark by this point. I'm alone in a cemetery. And this makes for good crime fiction, but this is true. My cell phone is dying because I'm using the flashlight on the cell phone, so I've got just like a little tiny bit of my light left. So I hightail it back up to the gazebo, and sure enough, her grave is among the kind of notable graves that they have mapped out. And I find it, and I'm trying to count, okay, it's 4 plots away from the fence, and this many. Okay, I think I got it. And I go back, but again, it's not laid out like we might see in a cemetery of more recent graves. And it's difficult to navigate because you don't want to step on anyone's grave, but then I couldn't find it, and it's just dark now, and I'm creeped out. So I just started taking pictures of my surroundings because I know I'm in the vicinity. And it could be right there, and I couldn't make it out because there were no strobe lights. So I just started taking pictures, and I took pictures of the ground all around me, feeling like if I could just capture it, I would be honoring her. And I don't know, it makes no sense, but that's what writers do, I guess. So this is what I sat down and wrote about for my essay, is this trip that I took. And I framed it, the bigger issue was this kind of conflict that I had with the tour guide. His romanticized version of the South that he was very comfortable with, and my love of Flannery O'Connor's work, which I thought took a more sophisticated, authentic approach to the issues. This butting up against each other of the two is how I framed the essay. And then I included a reading list of some of my favorite writers of Southern Gothic fiction. I had Flannery O'Connor on there, of course. I had Zora Neale Hurston, Eudora Welty, I think Toni Morrison. And I was proud of it. It meant a lot to me, just sort of analyzing. I hadn't ever just sat down and thought that much about Southern Gothic and what it encompassed and what it meant to me. And I turned it into my publicist, who turns it into the editor at the website, and they rejected it, which I got word of from my publicist. So I had the little temper tantrum that we writers have in private. And my publicist came back and she said, your voice is very important to them. They certainly want you to contribute, but your essay has nothing to do with crime fiction. And this was a website entirely devoted to crime fiction, as well as crime nonfiction and crime podcasts and crime. So really, it was my bad. So I thought, okay, I need to reevaluate. So I stepped back and I thought, what books do I want to capture that would include crime fiction? Because when I looked at the list that I had put together, they weren't writers of crime fiction. Now, I could have argued that there were multiple crimes being committed, but they were more moral and ethical issues than there wasn't a sheriff showing up at somebody's door arresting anybody for murder. So then I started to think about my own work. My first novel that I tried to get an agent for, that ultimately went on to get published, I didn't know that was going to be my first novel when I was writing it. That was Bent Road. It takes place in Kansas in the 1960s. That's the only book I wrote that was published that I didn't have an agent, or I had no thought of what are the book reviewers going to say about it, or will it get reviewed, and will they be good or will they be bad, and what will its Amazon ranking be? I didn't have any of that stuff. I was just writing for the pure love of writing, and I was writing a book that would compel the reader to turn the page. I wanted great character, I wanted great setting, I wanted themes to rise up out of those things that I would try to do as authentically as I could. Basically, I wanted to write the book I wanted to read. That was my only guide. I never thought about it being crime fiction, not really once, until the book was nominated for a crime fiction award. And then what happens if you sell a book and you have any success with it, then you're in that category. So after that first book, after Bent Road, I had to think about, okay, I write crime fiction, so what does that mean? So after I wrote about Kansas, I went up and wrote a book about Detroit, 1950s Detroit. Now, obviously, neither of those books are set in the South, but they both, I would argue, have a great deal of the same qualities of Southern Gothic. Maybe you'd call them Midwestern Gothic, I don't know. But they both had crimes. And then I settled down in Kentucky, and now I started to be called the writer of Southern Gothic. And Southern Gothic, I think of as including very specific elements, such as you have the beauty of the South through the beautiful live oaks and the Spanish moss, and you have the culture and the food and the music butting up against those things that are ugly about the South, the history, the racism of the South. You have the kind of the quintessential monstrous character or the crumbling house. Those are all elements that I had in my books. And I went back and took a look at that essay that got rejected and the books that were on there, and one stood out to me immediately, and I'm like, I'm surprised it never occurred to me before. But one of the books that was on my list, and it's my all-time favorite, and I realize now really how much of an impact it had on me as a writer, and that's Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. It's, of course, set here in Alabama. It is Southern Gothic fiction, to be sure. You have all those beautiful landscape and the kind of the facade of the seemingly tranquil small town, which is typical, butting up against the racism. You have the monstrous character in Boo Radley. You have the crumbling house next door. You have that creepy tree where the kids find the things, the knickknacks. But you also have a crime. And people don't often think about To Kill a Mockingbird as crime fiction, but you have a crime, and you have an arrest, and you have a trial, and you have an attorney, and Atticus Finch, one of my favorite characters. So Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird is this beautiful example of what happens when Southern Gothic meets crime fiction. And there's my new essay, because it involves crime. So I rewrote my essay, and I included some more contemporary books, which kind of fit into that little bit unusual category of Southern Gothic meets crime fiction. And one of the books I included on it, this was months ago, and I had yet to meet her, but I included Jen Phillips' The Well and the Mine, her debut, as it's set here in Alabama in the 30s and includes a crime of a, well, I don't want to give away any spoilers, but there is a crime early on. So it was accepted, and that I went on and I got over my initial rejection. And then as I'm sitting last night listening to Bryan Stevenson, I was thinking that same thing had happened as I came into Alabama. As I was coming in, and as many of us saw in national headlines, people saw around the country, was the newspaper editor who published the column calling for the rise of the KKK. And so that's what people are hearing coming out of Alabama. And I come to town, that going on, and clearly an example of the ugliness from the past rising up again here in the present. And then I come to last night's event, which was really extraordinary. As I said, I'm sitting up there. It's extraordinary, but I'm also thinking, what am I going to do? Because how do I stand in the same place and give a talk after hearing that? But Brian talked about hopelessness versus hope, and here he is giving this talk. It's inspirational and it's meaningful, and it's sold out in a minute. And what a beautiful thing that is, butting up against this very ugly thing. And when that juxtaposition happens and that rub happens, it just brings greater clarity, and I think helps us see both things even better because we have that comparison. Makes both of them easier to see, to understand, and to make sense of. So I'm thrilled that I got to come here and speak with all of you, but I'm thrilled as well that I got to hear Brian speak last night, because it motivated me to, with the next book that I'm working on that won't be done for another year. And I was saying this morning, they actually got to be the first, but my next book that comes out, I've been a little bit nervous about it. They're just starting the publicity, and I used them as guinea pigs this morning, and I'm going to use all of y'all too. All of y'all. There's myself. That's a badge of honor. I like that I just said that. It's a thriller, my next book. It is the first, and I mean this very literally. I've been writing for about 20 years. It was almost 10 years ago to the date, 10 years ago in May, when I signed with an agent and sold my first novel. It didn't come out till 2011. So I've been writing professionally for 10 years, but I worked for 10 years before that. This new novel, it's the first time in those 20 years that an editor of any sort, and in this case it's my editor at Dutton, said to me, "Lori, I'm liking the book, but we could slow down a little bit because of its fast pace, that it is a thriller." And I said, I don't have a problem doing that. I can put in those live oaks, and nothing rocks my world like a heart pine floor, or the great big baseboards. I love writing about that stuff, and so that was not difficult. And it's a book that I late one night, I'm watching Netflix on my phone, and my husband is asleep in bed next to me, and all of a sudden I get a Twitter notification pop up. If anybody's on Twitter, you know that somebody tags your name, it'll pop up and give you a notification. Well, it pops up, and I notice that it's from my agent, has tweeted something about me, and it's like 11:30 at night. That's unusual. But I had turned in this Gone Too Long, which comes out this summer. I had just turned it in like 2 days earlier. It was due on my birthday, actually. So this is just a couple days later. So I pop over to Twitter to see what she said. And she says something to the effect, "Reading Lori Roy's Gone Too Long, so scary I had to put it down," or something to that effect. And she attached one of the little GIFs or GIFs, whatever you call them, the little videos, And it's a little video of a guy running, screaming from the room. And I pop up in bed, because there is nothing that a writer likes more than a tweet just like that. So I pop up, and my husband's sleeping, and I want to wake him up, but I don't, because now it's getting close to midnight. But I'm up. I'm awake for the rest of the night. So I go out in the other room, and I tweet back to my agent, and a little GIF with me, I'm doing a happy dance in mine, or my little character's doing a happy dance. And then I get another tweet of a guy breathing into a paper bag, because it's so scary. She's having to stop and take breaks. She was eating some kind of ice cream or something between chapters. So my point is to say it is a thriller. For my agent to really like something that I've written means a lot to me. I think since Bent Road, she's not one to lavish praise. I'll just put it that way. So for her to do that meant a lot to me. But the other side of the book, and the part that makes me a little bit nervous about how to talk about, is that the book is set against the backdrop of the rise and escalation of white supremacy in the country in recent years. And it makes it very important to me, very significant, and for the time that I put into a book, the time that I spend with it, it's got to really matter to me personally. And that snuck up on me. I didn't see it coming. I mentioned all the research I was doing in Georgia. It's set near Stone Mountain in Georgia. If anyone of you are familiar with that, it has historic ties to the Klan. So it did sneak up on me, but it's an important book. I'm excited for it to come out. I still go back and occasionally reread those tweets because they're out there in my feed, and look at those GIFs or GIFs. I've got to figure out how you pronounce that. But anyway, that's a little bit about my writing process and about my next book. And you heard a little bit about the disappearing in the introduction. And now I'm sure we have some time for questions. If we have anybody that will put a hand in the air and ask a question. It's going to be hard to see. Yes, nice and loud. So she's asking, how do I work on one book and another book at the same time? Well, so I mentioned that my book was due on my birthday. So May 1st, I turned in my first draft of Gone Too Long, which is what comes out this summer, June 25th, and it is available for pre-order. Anyone's interested? The Disappearing is out on the table. I saw it. So that book was due May 1st. So I turn it in, and then I'm sort of in a holding pattern. And I had some short stories that I needed to write, but I also started working on the next one. And then I would get edits back on Gone Too Long, and so I'd put aside the new book, and I would work on those edits. Might be 2 or 3 weeks. And then I ship it back to my editor, and then I go back to the new book. And a lot of what I'm doing during that time is researching. I read a lot of nonfiction. I will do things like I'll go and visit. My next one the next one is Lake County, Florida, so that's near me. So I would go there and, walk or actually see it, touch it, see things, touch things. So it is a balancing act. The harder thing is that if somebody asks me a question about Until She Comes Home, that was like my second book, and you throw out a name, I may not remember the character. Or I'll get an email as somebody wanting me to, what really happened with this or that in the book, like something they didn't quite understand, and I honestly have no idea. Because it's been, that was maybe almost 10 years ago. So that's the hard part, is once you step out of a world into a new world, like I will go back and actually flip through a book and write names down. Now, of course, once I read them, it jogs my memory, but it's just going from one world to another. It can be tough to keep it straight. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, way up there.
How do you find an editor that you work well with? Is that something that the publisher assigns to you?
Okay, so the question was, how do I find an editor that I work well with? So the first step for me, anyway, as a traditionally published author, was to find an agent. Jenny Bent is my agent. She's very, very good at what she does. And then, so we'll take my debut with Bent Road. Jenny sends it to editors at various publishing houses that she knows love books like Bent Road. Just like all of you have your certain taste in books or movies or music or whatever, editors at publishing houses are the same. They kind of have their specialties. So she sent Bent Road to editors that liked crime fiction, suspense, literary fiction, kind of all those things mixed up together. And then my book, it ended up selling at auction, so there were a few editors that were interested in it. And I was lucky enough that I was able to talk with the editors at the various publishing houses. And then we settled on Dutton, which is a imprint of Penguin Random House. And I've been with Dutton for all 5 books. So far, that's 5. This is my 5th that's coming out. Although my initial editor has since left the company, so I've had a new editor with the last 2 books. And I've been very fortunate. The editors I've worked with have been wonderful. The publicity folks, the marketing folks. It's a really great team. So 10 years of hard work has helped to find an editor so good, is what I would boil it down to. Yes, ma'am, right here.
From what you said, I get the impression that your setting is very important to you. Do you have a story in mind before the setting, or do you find a setting and the story comes to you from that?
Okay, the question was setting appeared to be very important to me, and did I know story or setting first, or how did that work? And I appreciate that question because setting is of primary importance to me, I would say. It's sort of the first thing that sticks to my ribs, is how my grandmother would have said it. And it's sort of an intangible. I like a gritty setting. So rural western Kansas in the 60s in the summer, that's dry and, I mean, literally gritty. I like a setting that imposes itself on the characters. So 1950s Detroit, that culturally was imposing itself. This was the racial conflicts in advance of the riots of the 60s. All that was bubbling up in the book that I wrote. So setting really is where it starts. Character is very close behind that. And I might, because I do a lot of research, I'll find a snippet of something. Until She Comes Home is my 3rd. It's set on a lavender farm in Kentucky. And I came across an event in my research where the last lawful public hanging in the United States took place in Owensboro, Kentucky in 1936. And I say lawful in that it was handed down as judgment for someone who was tried and convicted of a crime. And I won't go into all the details of that, but it was really quite a significant event. A lot of unusual things surrounding it. Now, I fictionalized it for my book, but that was one of those stick-to-my-ribs moments. So setting was very closely tied, to that one event. It's just all a big jumbly mess, but setting, controlled chaos is how I often describe it, except for Gone Too Long, which comes out this summer. That was the first book, and remember I mentioned the agent who sent the GIF about the screaming from the room. It was the first book where a circumstance, a twist, was the first thing that I thought of. So it was a little different book for me. And in some ways it was easier to write, and in some ways it was harder. But, so honestly, I don't know, but setting is very important. Setting is very important, I will say that. How are we doing on, okay, yes.
You touched on this subject just a little. I read Bent Road and Until She Comes Home Again. And I felt there was an underlying theme that had to do with fear of the races. And I felt that they were, I guess, addressed rather passively. And I wondered if maybe if you've had a change of heart, are you going to address this more affirmatively in other books, or how do you feel about that?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. It was, Okay, well, and both of those books were set in the 50s and 60s. Like Until She Comes Home, that you mentioned, 1950s Detroit. And I got a letter from someone who was very upset with me at the way the women were portrayed because they were at home taking care of their children, and couldn't they do anything else? I was like, well, first of all, they did do a lot more than that because they were the heroes, in essence, of the story. But they're not heroes in the sense of they're not racing around the city in cop cars wielding guns. They were women of the 50s and 60s, largely in the roles that were available to them. It's not the same for us today. So I can't rewrite the 50s and say, this is how I wish it was for women. I wish people would stand up more to racism. Well, I may wish that, but that's not the way it was. My husband was born in Detroit and lived there for several years, and I talked to him a lot. There is a black woman who was killed in the book who was supposedly a prostitute. And I asked him, how would that have been treated by the police, in your opinion, having lived there? He said it largely would have been disregarded. It would not have been what we would expect it to be, what we might hope it would be today, that she would be treated like a person and it would be taken seriously. So it is, when you're writing about the past, you don't want to be cliche and you don't want to be stereotypical, but you also can't rewrite it to what you think it should have been or what we would have hoped it would be. And by the same token, this is something I kind of learned after the fact. When I wrote Bent Road, it was set in the 60s. And I got the question often when that came out, why did you set the book in the past? And I honestly didn't know. You know, it was my first book. It's my first time being interviewed. I thought it was kind of an odd question. I was like, so I sort of made up my voice fits better with I don't know what I said. It was nonsensical. But then when I was researching Until She Comes Home, one of the things I did was I went out on eBay and I bought Sears catalogs, for example, from like the 50s, which are the greatest thing ever for research. And they're really great for shopping for clothes, too, because the clothes are beautiful. I bought magazines, anything I could get my hand on, and I also bought cookbooks from the 50s. And, the language and the food, there's just some great nouns in there. But there's also the introductions, both to the book and the various chapters, that gave this really unique insight into how women were being talked to at the time. And this is when my daughter was in high school, and myself and some other moms were sitting on the sidelines while our daughters were playing basketball. It was a summer camp. And I was reading from this cookbook to my friends. And in the cookbook, it talks about, women today, we're more and more stressed in the home. We no longer have family living nearby to help us with our, raising our kids. We no longer have the friendly butcher down the street. We have the big generic grocery store chain. We have news coming at us and information from radio, television, magazines, just bombarding us constantly every day. And we have more and more technology coming into our homes that it's meant to make life easier and easier for us, but all that really happens is more and more is expected of us. So I'm reading this to my friends who are all tired because they've been running their kids around all summer long. They're why can't we just stay home in the summer and do nothing? And they're listening to me read this, and they're all like nodding their heads like, I know, isn't that true? And I said, you know what? That was written in 1958. And that was a big moment for me as a writer, because when I realized that's why I love writing about the past. Now, I've also written about the present, although the past is usually brought in and addressed. But you see something in the past, like the last lawful hanging, for example, and you think, well, those are mistakes they made back then. That's how they treated people back then. And then as you read and you get deeper into it, and you start to realize, except I see those same things in our headlines today. And seeing that we're not better than our past, and if we don't realize that, we're doomed to repeat our past, it opens up your perspective in a whole new way. We were no different than those moms in 1958. You throw the internet in there and like a Google search or Amazon, and it's the exact same thing. But I think it's just kind of natural that we think our problems are unique to us, and they're not. And reading that to my friends, it was this whole, I don't know, I understood at that point why I write about the past. So that was a long-winded answer to, I hope I even answered the question. We have, okay. Yes, right here.
To have your book go to auction seems like a great honor. Can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Yes, it was a fun process. So I'll make it a quick answer. So when I mentioned my agent sends the book out to various publishing houses, the various editors, she asked me, do you want to see the emails they send back? So she would email them, here's the book, and then they might email their thoughts or whether they're interested or not. And I said, yeah, I want to see them. And, you know, they were all very professional and respectful, and some, you know, it's a nice book, it's not for me, or I love this book, and I'm interested in you know, following up. And then I'd see things like, one editor, I remember, sent her a message and said, ooh, the literary scouts are buzzing about this one. And so I get over on Google, what is a literary scout? Because I didn't know. And so then one of the emails comes through, and the memo was auction of Lori Roy. I'm like, what does that mean? So I didn't know it was going to auction. But what had happened was there was more than one editor interested. Very quickly, one was interested, like within the next day of getting the book. And so I had visions of, probably know where I'm going, I think we're on the courthouse steps. And all the editors are on the steps, and my agent's got a gavel and a podium just like that. But that's not what it is. It's, you know, caller with what your offer, and it's on the phone. And I got the morning, tell me if I'm going too long, I woke up on auction day, it was a Thursday. I was going to a little part-time, I used to be a tax accountant years ago, so I was doing kind of a little part-time tax accounting thing. And I woke up on auction day, and I was getting ready for that, and I was drying my hair, and I stand up right as my husband's walking in the room, and I am full-on sobbing. I mean, the makeup is running down my face, I'm not particularly emotional. I was a tax accountant, so you know I'm not an emotional person. And he's like, what's wrong? And I said, it's not going to sell. And it wasn't just that it's not going to sell, it's that the last 10 years are going to be wadded up and thrown away because they didn't matter. Like that was it was ridiculous, but that's how I felt. And he's like, it'll be fine. So I went to where I was at that job. It was really before the whole texting and wasn't quite as accessible on smartphones. And I got an email from my agent, call me. And so I left. I got in my car. I drove. I couldn't drive and take the car because I was shaking. And I happened to pull into a little bookstore nearby, which is where I would go on to do my first book signing. And I took the call, and she said, we got our first offer. And then an auction is just, if other editors are interested, they will call, and it's kind of the bidding went on through the weekend. I was able to talk to a few editors, I think on Monday, and then we had a deal. So there's no courthouse steps involved, and there was no gavel. Thank you all so much.